Fairy Tale. I Ate a Dragon at the Beginning. Chapter 1. Roar. The roar of some kind of animal echoed in the forest. As the fierce roar sounded, countless birds above the forest were frightened and flew around. In the forest, a skinny boy with a pale face was hunched over. He glanced around with fearful eyes. He quickly got into the bushes on the side and hid his body in it. He looked around with fearful eyes. There was an unpleasant stench coming from the young man's body. But it was as if the young man couldn't smell it at all. He put his arms around his head and buried his head deeply between his knees. His body began to tremble uncontrollably until he heard a fierce roar in his ears. After the sound fell, the boy slowly exhaled. The boy's name was Lin En. He had been in this forest for a week. He didn't know what happened to him. He was originally just climbing a mountain, but then he walked into a forest, came to this place. And his body became his own. Looking at his thin limbs, he couldn't feel any strength in his body, and he raised his head and looked through the shade of the tree. Lin En couldn't feel any warmth from the sunlight that shone down. He felt that he could not find a way out in this forest, and the energy in his body was no longer enough to sustain him for too long. How did he get here? He didn't know where it was. Lin En just wanted to get out of this forest quickly and take a hot bath and eat something hot. Since arriving in this forest, Lin En has often heard the roar of the beast in the forest. Lin En has no idea what kind of roar it is, as if it didn't exist on the earth just yesterday. Lin En saw with his own eyes two mountain-like ferocious beasts biting and fighting in front of him. The sharp canine teeth were even bigger than his own, and Lin En realized it only after seeing the two giant beasts. He may no longer be on Earth. He has traveled through time. The hunger in his body made Lin grit his teeth, stretched out his hand, picked up a handful of leaves from the bush in front of him, and stuffed it into his mouth, although it was bitter and hard to swallow. This was the only food available to Lin En. His mouth was extremely dry because he hadn't drank water for a long time, and his lips had begun to crack. He pushed himself forward with difficulty. He didn't know where his destination was. He just knew that if he kept moving forward, he would be able to walk out of the vast forest sooner or later. But Lin En didn't know that if someone looked down from high in the sky, he would be able to see Lin En at a glance. The way forward is the endless forest. If this situation continues, Lin En will become the nutrient in this forest sooner or later. Lin En's body is extremely weak. Even if he pushes himself forward, his speed is still very slow. We haven't gone very far in the day, and we still have to be wary of the beasts that appear. Fortunately, the sour smell on Lin En's body also provides Lin En with a layer of protection. I don't know how long he walked, but the sky has completely darkened. In this invisible forest, Lin felt a little more fear. As Lin moved forward, a huge shadow appeared in front of him. It looks like it should be a hill. Lin En staggered towards the huge shadow, and an uncomfortable feeling surged in Lin En's heart. As he got closer and closer to the huge shadow, Lin felt that his steps were getting heavier and heavier, as if something was pressing on him. Not only was it physically heavy, but for some reason I just felt a suppressed emotion was born in my heart. It wasn't until Lin En came in front of this huge shadow that Lin En could breathe a sigh of relief. When I stretched out my palm and landed on this huge hill, it felt cold, but there was no frosting feeling like sand and stone. The smooth feel made Lin couldn't help but rub it for a while. After arriving at the side of this huge hill, there was a faint fishy smell in the air, but at this time, Lin didn't think much about it. The breeze kept blowing across Lin, making the tired Lin relax a lot. After a while, Lin En felt sleepy coming into his heart. Lin En lay down under the hill, curled up and fell asleep. Until the next day, the scorching sun shone overhead, and there was no shade around to block the scorching sun. Lin En opened his eyes with difficulty. The scorching sun above his head caused Lin En, who had just opened his eyes, to subconsciously squint his eyes. He slowly stood up with his hands on the smooth hill behind him. Even under the scorching sun, the hill was still cold to the touch. Curious, Lin turned his head and looked towards the hills behind him. The pupils shrank suddenly, and a look of fear suddenly appeared in his eyes. In front of Lin, there was a huge hill. This is a ferocious monster. He was standing next to his head, and the breeze that kept blowing was just the breath exhaled from his nose. The unknown monster in front of him didn't know whether he hadn't noticed any trace of Lin En, or whether he was completely ignoring Lin En in front of him. Lin gritted his teeth and walked cautiously towards the distance of the huge ferocious beast, with his toes on the ground and not daring to make any sound. Lin En didn't know that the moment he turned around, the eyes on the head of the ferocious beast behind him that were bigger than Lin En's head opened slightly, and after glancing at Lin En's back with the vertical pupils in the eye sockets, he slowly closed his eyes again. Just when Lin En was about to get away from this ferocious beast, a cold and ethereal voice suddenly came from his mind. Ding! Congratulations to the host for meeting the Dragon Clan and triggering the choice. System activation. As the ethereal voice sounded in his ears, Lin's footsteps paused slightly, and then his whole person stopped on the spot. Looking back at the huge body of the ferocious beast, Lin En's body was trembling slightly. Half scared, half excited. System. Lin En stopped, with a little excitement in his pupils, and his whole body was trembling slightly. System. Lin's trembling voice sounded in the open space, with rotten trees at his feet, and his eyes were full of expectation. As Lin's voice fell, the cold voice in his mind continued to sound. Ding! Congratulations to the host for successful binding. Ding! The host encounters the Dragon Clan and triggers the initial selection task. As the sound of the system fell, Lin En exhaled heavily, with unstoppable surprise in his eyes. Lin subconsciously turned his head and looked at the huge hill behind him. It turns out that this is not a monster, but a real dragon. Although Lin En already knew that he was not on the earth when he saw the huge body of the ferocious beast that looked like a hill, but now that he knew about the existence of the dragon, he knew that this place could not be the earth. I still feel a little complicated. Although he was alone on earth without a father or a mother, Lin En still felt a little bitter about disappearing without leaving anything behind. Maybe no one on earth will remember me. Thinking of this, Lin En's eyes showed a hint of helplessness. But at the next moment, Lin's breathing suddenly stagnated, and his whole body began to tremble. This time it was not because of the surprise that appeared in the system, but because of fear. After Lin En turned around, the giant dragon lying on the ground opened its eyes at some point, and its huge vertical pupils stared straight at him. There seemed to be a human look in the huge eyes, staring straight at his figure. Lin could even hear her teeth chattering. Although the giant dragon discovered him, he didn't seem to make any move. There was no movement for a long time, just looking at myself quietly. When Lin En saw this scene, he bravely walked towards the dragon step by step. Since the emergence of the system is related to this giant dragon, he cannot leave here easily. And just as Lin En approached the dragon, the voice of the system sounded in his mind. Ding! Congratulations to the host for triggering the initial selection. Choice 1. Sit back and ignore this dying dragon. Reward. You will get a complete dragon corpse in 3 days. Choice 2. Save the dragon. Reward. After rescuing the dragon himself will teach you dragon slaying magic and become a dragon slaying mage. Choice 3. Eat the dragon. Reward. Devour the dragon's soul, transplant the dragon heart, and become a humanoid dragon. In front of Lin En, a light curtain appeared, and on the light curtain were lines of text. 3 options, 3 rewards. Lin En's eyes lit up instantly. But after seeing the words on the light screen, the luster in his eyes faded half a bit. Because of these options, option 1 is undoubtedly the most practical. Treating the giant dragon, not to mention it is difficult for me to survive now. Even if I am in good health now, I still don't know how to treat illnesses and save people, let alone save a dying dragon. As for option 3, if you can swallow everything in the dragon, the reward will undoubtedly be extremely rich, but do you really have the ability to do it now? A look of hesitation flashed in his eyes. If he chooses 1, even if he gets a dragon corpse, what's the use of it? In this barren forest, he had no power to restrain the chicken, so even if he got it, he wouldn't be able to defend the dragon corpse. There are countless powerful monsters in this forest. In front of them, I can't even think of resisting. Gritting his teeth, Lin En's eyes flashed with a fierce look. System, I choose 3. His eyes were fierce. Since the system gave this option, it means there is a way to do it. As Lin En's voice fell, the system beeped, and then the text on the light screen in front of him suddenly disappeared, leaving only the text of option 3 appeared on it. There was a clang and a dagger appeared in front of Lin En. The dagger glowed coldly under the scorching sun. Lin En swallowed and went straight. He walked towards the giant dragon in front of him. Naturally, the giant dragon saw Lin En's movements, with a sharp chill in his eyes. His huge body trembled, as if he wanted to make a move, but his near-death state made him tremble. It was difficult for him to move his huge body. He watched Lin En coming to him, his huge vertical pupils staring straight at Lin En's figure. The dagger pierced his body hard. The dragon was still thinking about how a dagger like this could break through his dragon scales. But what followed was a sharp pain, and he saw the dagger sticking straight. It pierced into his own dragon scales, and blood spurted out, sprinkling onto Lin En's cheeks. Lin En's pale face was filled with bright red blood, and he looked extremely ferocious when he saw the dagger in his hand. It was so sharp that a joyful look flashed in his eyes. He licked the blood from the corner of his mouth and worked harder to carve out the dragon's scales. Because his body was too weak, Lin En could only rest for a long time before carving off a piece of the dragon. The dragon's scales were cut off. The constant feeling of hunger in his stomach made Lin forget everything, and he rushed towards the bright red flesh with his dagger, gnawing at it with his teeth, and finally carving at the dragon's wound. A piece of flesh and blood came down. He threw the flesh and blood into his mouth without any explanation, and started chewing it. Although it was difficult to chew and had a fishy smell, Lin En was already crazy with hunger and completely forgot about what was in his mouth. Meat is the meat of a giant dragon. Ding! Congratulations to the host for completing the selection task. Ding! Start giving out selection rewards. Closing square bracket. As Lin swallowed the flesh and blood in his mouth, the ethereal and cold voice of the system in his mind sounded in Lin's mind. Just as the sound of the system fell, the giant dragon crawling in front of Lin suddenly roared. The loud sound frightened the birds in the forest and fled in a hurry. In the surrounding forest, Lin heard the sounds of many monsters escaping. The giant dragon's huge vertical pupils were filled with pain, and a huge scream came from its mouth. Then he raised his huge head high and fell heavily to the ground the next moment, completely losing his movement. And just after the dragon lost its movement, a misty soul floated out of the dragon's body and wandered towards Lin En. Lin En's body seemed to be imprisoned in place, unable to move. He could only watch the huge soul slowly sinking into his body, until the dragon's tail of the soul was completely submerged into his body. The tearing pain kept flooding into Lin's mind, and his already pale face became even paler, without any blood at all. After a long time, Lin finally raised his head, breathing heavily. As the dragon's soul was completely devoured by him, Lin En gained the dragon's huge memory. The dragon's name is Christine Nickel. He is one of the kings of the dragon clan. Yes, this is a dragon king. At the same time, Christine learned from her memory that this world is a magical world. Dragons, humans, and monsters coexist in this world. This continent is called a slant, and there is a lost magic among humans called Dragon Slayer magic, which is a magic that can truly destroy dragons. Seeing this, Lin paused slightly. This setting is somewhat similar to an anime I once watched. Fairy Tale. As the memory was gradually digested by Lin En finally understood. This is the world of Fairy Tale. Christine has been avoiding the black dragon Acnologia since 400 years ago, but she was still found by it. After a battle, although she was also injured, she was now in a state of near death. Until he was seen by Lin En, and finally died in Lin En's hands. In Christine's memory, Lin knew that he was an elemental dark dragon. He is the king of the dark dragon. The scales of the black dragon can ignore magic, and the claws of the black dragon can tear apart any element. The black dragon has no elements, but can swallow all magic. It is the true nemesis of magic. After exhaling a breath of turbid breath, he got all of Christine's memories. Lin couldn't help but think of the black dragon in the anime. The king of dragons and the black feather of the end, Acnologia. As Christine's dragon soul was completely devoured, Lin's body suddenly erupted with a huge amount of magic power, instantly sweeping through the Warcraft forest. The birds that had just fallen around were frightened and flew around again, running away in panic. The huge source of magic power caused Lin En's body to show signs of beginning to break apart. Cracks began to appear in his body, unable to withstand such a huge amount of magic power. The next moment, a stream of light appeared from Christine's dragon corpse, broke through the corpse, and rushed directly to Lin's body. Lin En, who had lost consciousness due to the impact of the huge magic power, stood there, his eyes white and stagnant. That stream of light instantly sank into Lin En's chest, rushed directly into Lin En's heart, and replaced Lin En's heart. This is Christine's dragon heart. As Kristen's dragon heart sank into Lin's body, the body gradually stopped cracking due to the huge magic power and gradually began to heal. And in the blood vessels under Lin's skin, streams of light were constantly flowing in the blood vessels. The blood enters the dragon's heart and is then transported throughout the body. The eyes that had lost their vitality gradually recovered, and Lin En, who had regained consciousness, let out a heavy breath. Although he still cannot control the huge magic power in his body, Lin En will no longer be overwhelmed by this magic power. The feeling of hunger kept coming from his belly. Lin En glanced at the huge dragon corpse not far away and walked straight forward. The palms turned into sharp dragon claws, directly gouging out a large piece of flesh from the dragon corpse. Lin didn't hesitate at all and stuffed the flesh and blood directly into his mouth. After devouring the dragon soul and transplanting the dragon's heart, Lin En can now be said to be a giant dragon in human form. Able to transform between human form and dragon form at any time. Lin did not waste Christine's flesh and blood at all. After becoming a humanoid dragon, Lin temporarily lived here. In order to be able to control the huge magic power in his body, Lin En fought monsters in the forest every day, learning to control his power between life and death. When you are thirsty, drink dragon blood, and when hungry, eat dragon meat. Lin found a source of fire the next day so he didn't have to continue chewing on Christine's flesh and blood. Although dragon blood is very fishy, it is a great tonic and can strengthen one's body very well. Although the dragon heart was transplanted, his blood became real dragon blood under the transformation of the dragon heart. The dragon blood continued to strengthen his body, but this was also a process. Lin En collected the excess dragon blood and soaked his body in the dragon's blood every day after fighting so that his body could absorb it better. The roar of the black dragon. In the forest, a raging dragon's breath swept over, directly overturning all the trees in the forest. A huge monster had a ferocious face, and its eyes were full of fear of the dragon's breath. But under its feet, there was a ball of water that looked like water. The thick liquid was tightly trapped in place, and the black water tightly grasped his limbs. He could only watch as the terrifying dragon's breath swept in, completely crushing and destroying his body. After dispersing, the small mountain-sized monster disappeared, leaving only a thick mass of black water. A figure fell on the ground, wearing rag-like clothes and various animal skins. It was draped over the young man's body. He stretched out and looked at the ruins around him that seemed to have experienced a storm. Lin En's eyes showed some satisfaction after staying in this forest for a year. He has been learning how to control the huge magic power in his body. All the monsters in the forest have become Lin's training tools. Although Lin has no one to teach him, Christine's huge memory exists in Lin's mind. Now that Lin En's body has been transformed by dragon heart and dragon blood, Lin En can now be said to be a young dragon of the dragon tribe. Lin En took a look at the place where he has lived for nearly a year. There was a bit of complexity in En's eyes. Christine's dragon corpse seemed to be indestructible. Even though there was still a lot of dragon meat on it, there was still no sign of decay. Lin returned to Chris. Next to Ting's dragon corpse, he stretched out his hand and touched it. Then the huge dragon corpse disappeared from Lin En's eyes, and a light curtain that only he could see appeared in front of Lin En. On the light screen, there is a plan of a small space. In the space, countless monster skins are piled in one corner. The huge dragon corpse is piled in the other corner and there are a dozen more. There was a huge stone pit filled with bright red and thick blood. These were all good things, but they couldn't be wasted. After exiting the system space, Lin's eyes were on them. I looked around and took a look at the place where I had lived for nearly a year. It's time to leave. Lin En muttered to himself, and the next moment, behind Lin En, a pair of dragon wings suddenly grew out, and with a flutter of the wings, Lin En's body soared into the air. The wings flapped, holding Lin's body upright and floating in midair. In Lin En's eyes, there seemed to be a vertical pupil deep in the pupil. He looked around with sharp eyes, then flapped his wings and flew quickly, making a sonic boom sound in the air, and the whole person disappeared in an instant. Lin En's speed was extremely fast, and the surrounding scenery kept passing by both sides of Lin En, and he was speeding behind him. Not long after, Lin saw the edge of the Warcraft forest. With a wave of his wings, Lin speeded up again and rushed out towards the edge of the Warcraft forest. What it is. At the edge of the Warcraft forest, a woman in a team suddenly saw a black figure passing by on the ground. She quickly raised her head and looked overhead, only to see a figure with two wings on its back fluttering high in the sky. Gao Fei sped away behind him and others. The woman's words attracted the attention of others, and they all raised their heads and looked at the figure in the distance. Everyone saw the figure in the sky, but they didn't know it. What kind of creature was that? Lin En flew aimlessly in the sky after leaving the World of Warcraft forest. The clouds in the sky kept slapping Lin En's cheeks and moving behind him. Not long after, Lin En's sight came. The outline of a town appeared, and a joyful look flashed in his eyes. The wings behind him flapped violently, and he flew towards the town. Lin En landed on the outskirts of the town, and the wings behind him disappeared and he took a step forward. Walking towards the town. Lin En's eyes were filled with curiosity as he looked at the bustling streets and the bustling streets. It had been a year since Lin En came to this world, and he had never really experienced it before. Life in this world is like living between blood and fire every day, feeling the fight between life and death like never before. This town is very close to the Warcraft forest, so the folk customs in the town are also a little bit different. Not long after Lin En came to this town, he had already seen several violent incidents. Lin En stopped a person on the street and asked him, "Where is this place? Where can I exchange for Warcraft skins?" The person held by Lin En turned around. Just when he was about to get angry, he suddenly saw the vertical pupils in Lin En's eyes and Lin En's weird dress. He said hopefully, "This, here is Brooknol, the city of mercenaries." Lin En nodded slightly, and then heard the man continue to say, "There is a mercenary center in the center of the city, where you can exchange for supplies." After saying that, the man broke away from Lin En's hand and drilled it without waiting for Lin En's answer. Into the crowd. Lin En didn't care and walked toward the center of the city. Soon Lin arrived at what the man called the mercenary center. The tall building made Lin slightly stunned. Lin had only seen this kind of magnificent Western-style building on TV in his previous life. Walking into this tall building, Lin En's weird outfit immediately attracted the attention of many people. Lin En walked straight to the counter in front and said to a woman among them, "Do you accept Warcraft skins here?" The woman did not raise her head, lowered her head and asked Lin En, "Where is your mercenary brand?" Lin En was slightly startled, and then asked, "I sell Warcraft skins, but I also need the mercenary brand." "Nonsense, we only serve mercenaries, do you think anyone can sell things to us?" The woman raised her head impatiently, glanced at Lin En's shabby clothes, with a look of disdain in her eyes. Lin En nodded slightly, and then asked, "Then I want to register as a mercenary." The woman sneered, looked Lin En up and down, and said, "Little brother, this is not playing house. You'd better go home as soon as possible." Lin En frowned, with a hint of chill in his eyes. The dragon's aura and blood suddenly surged out of Lin En's body, covering the woman's body. The terrifying aura enveloped the woman, and fear suddenly appeared in her eyes. He was sitting there with cold hands and feet, looking at Lin En blankly, with fear deep in his eyes. Grown-ups. At this time, a voice sounded in Lin En's ears, and a well-dressed figure appeared behind him at some point. He looked at him with a smile. Something's wrong. Lin En had a chill in his eyes. He turned around and glanced at the man behind him. The aura of terror that enveloped the woman suddenly dissipated, and the woman was able to take a breath and looked at Lin En with fear in her eyes. Just now I felt like I was about to be killed, as if I was being stared at by a terrifying monster. "Sir, I am the person in charge of the Brooknol Mercenary Center. I can apply for a mercenary identity card for you." The well-dressed man smiled, bent slightly towards Lin En, and said with a smile. The vertical pupils in Lin En's eyes scanned the man in front of him, then he took back his breath, nodded slightly and said, "Then let's get started." The man immediately breathed a sigh of relief and took Lin into the room behind the mercenary center. Because he was applying for an identity card, Lin only passed the test after showing his physical strength. After that, he was issued a your own identity card. Do you accept Warcraft skins here? Lin En put away his identity card and then asked the man in front of him. The man nodded and said with a smile, "This is natural. We at the Mercenary Center will kill Warcraft in the commission. Get it at the best price." Lin En nodded slightly, then waved his right hand, and piles of monster skins appeared in front of Lin En, almost filling the whole room. Let's see how much it's worth. Lin sat on the sofa and looked at the stunned man opposite. The man swallowed and quickly said to Lin, "Wait a moment, I'm going to find someone to test it." With that said, without waiting for Lin En to answer, he turned around and left the room. After a while, the man returned to the room with an old man. When the old man saw that the room was filled with monster skins, he was stunned. After looking at the man beside him, Lin En's eyes fell on Lin En, who was sitting on the sofa board, watching the old man and the man busy. After a long time, the man stood up and walked to Lin En. Wiping the sweat on his forehead, he said to Lin En, "Sir, the Warcraft skins here are all high quality, and we can buy them all. The price is 350 WJ. Do you think it is okay?" There was obviously respect in the man's voice. Among these monster skins, there are many skins of high-level monsters, and they are extremely complete. There was no damage at all during the battle. It is obvious that the person who did it was very strong. Lin En had no expectations about the price, so he nodded and agreed. Not long after, the man came to Lin En with a card and said to Lin En, "Sir, 350 WJ has been deposited to this deposit card. Among them, the password is your mercenary identity card, please keep it." Lin En took the deposit card and threw it directly into the system space. Then he asked the man in front of him, "Since you are a mercenary center, can you accept commissions here?" The man nodded repeatedly and said, "Okay. Sir, your current identity card is A level, and all the commissions you can accept are in the lobby." Lin walked out of the room and walked straight towards the commission board in the hall. At this moment, a commission on the commission board suddenly caught Lin En's attention. It was not because of how interesting the commission was. It was because of the client. Name: Yude Heartfilia. Lucy's father in the anime. I just don't know what year it is. I don't know if Lucy's mother passed away. There is also a legendary celestial spirit mage. Although he only has 3 keys to the zodiac, he is not a weakling to be called an old friend by the celestial spirit king. After accepting the commission from the Ya family, Lin En walked straight to the counter. The woman who was still aggressive before became extremely respectful. Seeing Lin En appear in front of her again, she quickly handled the commission for Lin En. Lin En didn't waste any words, picked up the commission and the map and left the mercenary center. Looking at Lin's leaving figure, the woman suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. The person in charge of the mercenary center appeared behind him at some point and was about to speak. The man's cold eyes swept across her face. Snapped. Eyeless thing. After leaving the mercenary center, Lin used the money in his hand to buy a few sets of suitable clothes. Lin En looked at the order form in his hand. The client on it was none other than the head of the Heartfilia family, Jude Heartfilia. The commission was to protect the Heartfilia family at a cocktail party a week later. As for the reasons not mentioned above, you should go and find out for yourself. Putting away the order form, Lin walked out towards the Brooknell train station with a hint of curiosity in his eyes. This city is extremely prosperous. Because it is very close to the Warcraft forest and the mercenary center is here, the transportation is very developed. Lin soon got on the train to the Heartfilia family. Sitting on the train, Lin En stared at the scenery outside the window. The rumble of the train echoed in Lin's ears, and soon he felt a little tired. Suddenly woke up. Lin En's face became a little ugly, his eyes scanned the surroundings, but he didn't find anything unusual. Am I too sensitive? He murmured to himself, his eyes constantly scanning everyone around him, but no one noticed anything unusual. Lin En let out a heavy breath and couldn't help but smile bitterly. It seems that I still have not adapted to life outside the world of Warcraft Forest. In the Warcraft Forest, you live between life and death every day, and you must beware of sneak attacks by Warcraft at any time. Now it suddenly became so comfortable, which made Lin unable to adapt for a while. The train was very fast, and it didn't take long to pass through several towns and arrive at the town where the Hartfilia family was located. Lin got off the train in the city. After walking out of the train station, I saw a middle-aged man standing there with the Hartfilia family sign written on it from a distance. Lin stepped towards the man. When Lin En came to him, the middle-aged man noticed Lin En in front of him. Are you Mr. Lin? Lin En raised her eyes and glanced at him, nodded slightly and said to him, let's go. Mr. Lin, please get in the car and wait a moment. There are 2 guests behind you. After the middle-aged man led Lin into a car, he closed the door and returned to where he was and continued to wait. Not long after, Lin saw outside through the glass of the window, and 2 people appeared in front of the middle-aged man. 2 figures, a man and a woman. After talking to the middle-aged man, the middle-aged man led them to Lin En's car and opened the door. The 2 were slightly startled when they saw Lin En. This is Mr. Lin En from the Mercenary Guild, and he also accepted the commission from our master. The middle-aged man saw their expressions and explained to them with a smile. The 2 nodded and stopped paying attention to Lin after getting in the car. In their eyes, most of the mercenaries were some warriors who didn't know magic were completely ignored by their magicians. Lin En glanced at the 2 of them, then closed his eyes and took a nap. The carriage jolted slightly and left the town towards the suburbs. Go. Not long after, the group arrived at a huge manor. The middle-aged man opened the car door for several people and said, several guests have arrived at Hartfilia Manor. Lin En opened his eyes, jumped off the carriage first, and walked into the manor. The man and woman were about to get out of the car, but Lin En got there first, and suddenly became a little angry. The man was about to step forward to speak, but was blocked by someone behind him. The woman held her arm and shook her head slightly. The man snorted, and then said sarcastically, this is the of the Mercenary Guild, and he doesn't understand any etiquette. Lin stopped, turned around, and glanced at the man with the vertical pupils in his eyes. A chill instantly surged up from the man's heart. For some reason, just after being glanced at by the young man's vertical pupils, he just felt as if he was being targeted by some ferocious beast. Lin En's limbs became cold, with a sneer on his lips, and then he stopped paying attention to the 2 people in front of him. What's wrong with you? The woman also noticed the man's abnormality, and quickly stepped forward to hold the man's arm. When the woman pulled him, the man's body suddenly collapsed on the ground, and his lips were trembling slightly. The woman's face became a little ugly, and she pulled the man. He pulled him up from the ground with his arms. With an ugly smile on his face, he said to the middle-aged man, please take us to see Mr. Jude. We want to ask him some details. The middle-aged man nodded. Then he glanced at the limp man hesitantly and asked, is it really okay for Mr. Harry to do this? The woman shook her head, looked at Harry next to her with hatred, forced a smile and said, it's okay, don't worry. The middle-aged man nodded slightly and led the 3 of them towards the manor. The woman stared at Harry's back with consideration in her eyes. She noticed Harry's trembling beside her, and she became even more curious in her heart. He knowing that all this must be related to the young man in front of her, but she had no substantive evidence, she could only give up. The group soon arrived at Hartfilia's manor and saw a serious-looking man. Sir, several guests have arrived. The middle-aged man walked forward respectfully, bowed slightly to the man and said, thank you for your hard work, Robin. The man nodded slightly, then stood up and walked towards Lin En and others. It is my honor to be able to help you solve your problems. Let me introduce myself. I am the client of this commission, Jude Hartfilia. Let me introduce myself. I am the client of this commission, Jude Hartfilia. Jude came to the front of the 3 people and saw Harry with an abnormal expression at a glance. He frowned slightly, but still did not make any other statement. He said to several people, in 6 days, Hartfilia family is going to hold a banquet to entertain many dignitaries of the Kingdom of Fury, and not long ago the bandit gang Dillies and his gang announced that they would destroy the Hartfilia family at this banquet, so I hope you can stop this group of bandits outside the manor and let the reception go smoothly. Quote. Jude's eyes swept across the 3 people in front of him, but the look he looked at Harry clearly showed a little dissatisfaction. This was not even the content of the commission, but now it has become like this. Is this really reliable? Mr. Heartfilia, we are magicians from the Serious Eye of the Magicians Guild. My name is Quora, and his name is Harry. The woman was a little dissatisfied when she saw Jude's eyes, and quickly stepped forward to introduce him to Jude. De nodded slightly, then looked at Lin En. Lin En raised his head, glanced at him with his pair of vertical pupils, and said lightly, "Mercenary, Lin En." Jude's mouth twitched slightly. Looking at the three people in front of him, he couldn't help but squeeze out a smile and said, "I'm going to invite a few of you to stay in the manor these days. I hope I can rely on you all." Aoila said to Jude with a smile on her face, "Leave it to us, Mr. Heartfilia, we won't let the bandits threaten your reception." Jude nodded slightly and said before turning around to leave, "I hope so." Jude left, and the middle-aged man stepped forward to face Lin En and the others. Said, "Guys, please come with me, I will take you to your room. Heartfilia's manor is very large, and their rooms are in another villa." After sending the three people into the room, the middle-aged man said to them, "Please take a good rest here these 3 days. If you have any questions, you can call me at any time." The middle-aged man said with a habitual expression on his face. With a romantic smile, he bowed slightly to the three of them and then disappeared from their sight. After the middle-aged man left, Lin put his hands in his pockets and walked towards his room. Quira wanted to say something to Lin, but when she saw Harry next to her, she was immediately discouraged. He pulled Harry into the room with a stern face, and said to Harry with dissatisfaction in his tone, "Okay. It's time for you to wake up." Hearing Quira's voice, Harry turned himself mechanically head, looking at Quila with eyes filled with fear. Enough. Quila's eyes darkened, and a cold drink came from Quila's mouth. It was this cold drink that immediately made Harry wake up a little. He looked around blankly, with doubts in his eyes, and murmured, "Where is this? Why am I here?" Quila's face was extremely gloomy. She took a breath and said, "Harry, what's wrong with you? Why don't you wake me up quickly?" Quila's voice fell, Harry's eyes fell on Quila, and then his eyes gradually regained some clarity. A look of fear flashed in his eyes, and he said to Quila in fear, "Quila, he is a monster. He is not human. He is not human." Harry's voice kept echoing in the room, leaving Quila confused. Harry went crazy in the room for a while. Seeing that Harry finally calmed down, Quila stepped forward and handed over the entrusted content. "I told Harry." Harry nodded slightly, no longer as arrogant and domineering as before. Sheila was also a little curious about Lin's look, which could actually scare Harry like this. He was from the same guild as Harry, so he naturally knew how strong Harry was. He had never seen Harry look like this before. Back in the room, Lin lay on the bed, resting his arms on his neck and looking at the ceiling. Lin's 5 senses were extremely developed, and the conversation between Sheila and Harry in the room reached Lin's ears clearly. Lin's eyes were indifferent, and he stared blankly at the white ceiling. As night fell, Lin En had his first good sleep after coming to this world for more than a year. In the past few days, many magicians and mercenaries were arriving one after another. Jude attached great importance to this reception and hired a lot of magicians to arrange them outside the manor. Since Lin En and Sheila Harry arrived on the same day, the three of them were naturally arranged on the right side of the manor. In the past few days, Lin En had not seen Lucy in the manor. It seemed that she was protected by Jude in the most luxurious villa in the middle. As time went by, she finally arrived. On the day of the reception, Lin En and Harry Quila arrived at their seats, jumped up and sat on a tree branch with their legs crossed, leaning against the tree. Looking at the huge brightly lit villa in the center of the manor. Lin En closed his eyes and began to adjust his aura. Under the transformation of dragon blood and dragon heart, Lin En's physical fitness became extremely powerful. As night fell, darkness gradually enveloped the manor. Carriages drove toward the central villa from the entrance of the manor. Lin En sat in the tree without opening his eyes. Boom! With a violent explosion, the next moment you saw flames shooting into the sky in the direction of the main entrance of the manor. The explosion attracted the attention of Quora and Harry. The two of them jumped and came to another tree and stood on it. They looked towards the main entrance of the manor from the treetops, but it was still some distance away from the main entrance of the manor, and the two of them could only see the fiery red sky illuminated by the fire. Something happened, should we go over and take a look? There was a solemn look in Harry's eyes. He looked at each other and looked at the big tree where Lin was. Quilla shook his head and said, there is someone in charge over there. The mission is to guard this place. Harry nodded slightly, and then stood on the treetops to alert the surroundings. And the explosion seemed to be a signal. Sounds kept coming out of the darkness, rushing towards the manor. With the appearance of these people, everyone who accepted this commission began to take it seriously and treated it with dignity. The Dilly's bandits were also a famous bandit group in the Kingdom of Fury, including many magicians. Dilly's was an A-level mage, very powerful. The bandits roared and attacked the Heartfilia manor. Bandits kept appearing from the darkness, heading towards the manor with grins and roars. The impact came. Harry and Kia suddenly became solemn, jumped down from the tree, and stood calmly at the gate on the right side of the manor. From the corner of his eye, Harry saw an afterimage flashing out of the big tree nearby. He saw a black shadow rushing into the bandits in an instant, like a tiger rushing into a flock of sheep. Every time the black shadow flashed, it would bring a bloody storm. Harry's pupils shrank and he quickly focused on that one. Above the black shadow. I saw that the hands of the black shadow had turned into the claws of some kind of monster. Every time he waved his palms, he could tear the bodies of the bandits around him. He is a wizard. Harry's heart skipped a beat, and he looked at Lin's palms and said quickly. Kuila nodded and said to Harry, let's do it too. After the two of them finished speaking, a bright light rose from their feet. The magic circle rose from their feet. The flames condensed in Harry's palm, and the next moment it turned into a flame whip and struck forward. Flame whip. The areas hit were ignited with blazing flames, and the bandits could not extinguish the flames even if they rolled their bodies on the ground. Kuila clasped her hands together, and the sound of heavy beatings echoed in everyone's ears. Then I saw a bit of cold air gradually appearing in the sky, and a huge palm came down from the sky and struck down many bandits in an instant. Lin En turned around and glanced at the two people behind him, and then stopped paying attention to the two of them. The bright red and warm blood sprinkled on Lin En's body, making Lin En's body a little more evil. He stepped hard on the ground, and his whole body instantly jumped into the air. The roar of the black dragon. Lin En, who was flying in the air, opened his mouth, and the magic circle condensed in Lin En's mouth. The next moment, a raging darkness spurted out from Lin En's mouth, and instantly swept towards the bandits who were swarming on the ground. The turbulent darkness spread instantly, and before the bandits could react, they were completely swallowed up by the extreme darkness. The screams continued in the darkness, and Harry and Kuila saw it in front of them. At this scene, everyone looked at each other in shock. From the looks of Lin En's arms before, they thought Lin En was a magician, but now they saw Lin En using other kinds of magic to the extreme. There was blood flowing out from the darkness. The moonlight shone on the ground, and the two of them could only see the bright red on the ground. There was no one in front of Lin En and the others. A figure that can stand. Vomit. Lin's footsteps fell to the ground, but he heard a sound of retching behind him. He saw Kuila looking ugly, holding his knees and vomiting on the side. Although Harry did not vomit, his face was not good looking either. In front of him. This bloody scene directly impacted the hearts of the two of them. There were broken limbs everywhere, bright red and smelly blood was scattered everywhere, and red and white things were splashed around. Even if they were dead, their eyes were still there. They were all filled with deep fear. They didn't know what they were going through in that darkness, but they were both afraid of this group of enemies. After they were all slaughtered, the right side of the manor returned to peace. If it weren't for the bloody broken limbs on the ground, it would be impossible to imagine that there was a vigorous battle here, rather than a battle. An overwhelming massacre. In just a moment, the battle on the right side of the manor was over. These bandits failed to use their human wave tactics and were directly slaughtered by Lin En. At this moment, the inside of the manor suddenly happened. There was an explosion. Along with the explosion, the roars of the bandits kept ringing inside the manor, reaching the ears of the three people. They didn't know where the bandits had broken through and entered the manor. En turned around, looked at Harry and Kuila behind him and said, I'll leave this place to you two. After saying that, without waiting for the two to reply, a pair of broad wings suddenly rose up behind Lin En. Lin En flapped his wings, and his whole body instantly rose into the sky, carrying the strong wind and galloping towards the interior of the manor. The howling wind made neither of them could open their eyes. When they opened their eyes, Lin En was no longer visible. Rampant laughter echoed inside the manor, and the huge manor was full of bandits. Bandits holding weapons, with ferocious faces, and extremely scarlet eyes were wreaking havoc in the manor. There are many magicians blocking these bandits. Although the magicians were very powerful, they could not bear the large number of these bandits. In addition, the bandits' fearless charge soon caused gaps in the magicians' lineup. Waving his wings, Lin En stood in the air, looking at the scene below with cold eyes. He muttered to himself, "Trash." As he spoke, Lin flapped his wings and turned into an afterimage, falling straight from the air towards the ground of the manor. Viewed from a distance, Lin En's figure looked like a meteor wrapped in flames under the moonlight, exploding directly on the ground of the manor with a loud bang. Smoke and dust were everywhere, and the magicians and bandits around them all stopped and looked at the changes happening in front of them. The magicians' eyes were alert, and the various magic arrays under their feet lit up, and they continued to inject magic into them, guarding against what would happen next. Although the bandits were numerous in number, they did not dare to act rashly at this moment. After swallowing, they all set their steps and looked seriously into the depths of the smoke, hoping to see something in it. Not long after, a crisp sound slowly sounded in the smoke. Everyone's breath froze and they listened carefully to the small voice. As the voice sounded, a shadow came into everyone's sight under the moonlight. I saw this figure crawling out from the ground and twisting his neck. The crisp sound just now was the sound made by this figure twisting his neck. Then he displayed his dual weapons behind him, blowing away all the smoke and dust surrounding him, revealing his true appearance in the smoke and dust. Standing among the people on both sides, Lin En's vertical pupils glanced at both sides, and a look of dissatisfaction flashed in his eyes. Someone in the wizard's lineup immediately recognized Lin. Although Lin did not show off himself intentionally, many magicians still saw Lin during these days in Haliphilia Manor. I was deeply impressed by Lin En's weird vertical pupils. The bandits looked at each other and realized that this man seemed to be from the opposite camp. Suddenly a murderous look appeared in his eyes, and he rushed towards Lin En with a roar. "Bring it on. Let's fight." The vertical pupils in Lin En's eyes swelled slightly, and then a ferocious look of bloodlust appeared in Lin En's eyes. The wings behind him disappeared, and Lin En's hands turned into sharp claws, and his skin dark scales also appeared on his body. Lin En let out a hearty laugh, and then kicked his legs violently on the ground. The next moment, a sonic boom exploded in the manor. Instantly disappearing in place, the originally complete ground suddenly appeared with extremely long and narrow cracks, spreading with Lin En as the center, like a spider web. Lin En waved his claws and collided directly with the bandits. Behind Lin En, the magicians froze in place, staring blankly at the scene in front of them. The roars, screams, and ferocious laughter kept echoing. Lin En's body was covered in blood, as if he had endless energy, constantly tearing apart the bandits who appeared in front of them. Roar. A cheerful roar came from his throat, and the bloodthirsty color in Lin En's eyes became even more intense. They were killed one after another, and the corpses in front of Lin En piled up like a mountain. Lin En had to walk up step by step. Standing on a high place, Lin En looked down at the bandits below, the bloodthirsty color in his eyes not diminishing. "Come. Keep fighting." Lin En let out a roar, like a wild beast, and rushed down the mountain of corpses in the next moment, rushing straight towards the bandits below. Although the bandits were not afraid of death, they were already overwhelmed by the scene in front of them. They were stunned until the body of the bandit in front was torn apart by Lin En, and the blood and flesh splashed on the faces of the bandits around him. The warm flesh and blood immediately made the bandits let out screams. Regardless of the trampling, they backed away. They had seen a lot of corpses, but they had never seen this scene of corpses and blood. There were broken limbs, arms, thighs, and bodies everywhere, and they were all cut into bright red pieces. The blood and white brains were all over the ground, turning black under the trampling of many bandits. Although the bandits retreated, Lin En felt a strong bloodlust for some reason. The feeling was that they wanted to kill everything in front of them. The screams of the bandits continued. The magicians behind the mountain of corpses finally recovered from their sluggishness and looked at the mountain of corpses and sea of blood in front of them, Many people's faces became extremely pale, and they started to retching while lying on the side. Who is he? The scene before them left an indelible fear in the hearts of many magicians. Lin En, who was chasing the bandits, didn't know that he had left such a shadow on these magicians. All he wanted in his mind at this moment was to kill all the life in front of him. His eyes gradually turned red, and he waved his sharp claws to harvest the lives in front of him. Boom! Just when Lin En continued to chase the bandits, a figure suddenly fell from the sky and landed heavily on the ground, stopping Lin En's figure. Lin En stopped, lowered his eyes, and tilted his head to look. The figure appeared in front of him. A thin man walked out slowly, with a ferocious look in his eyes. After looking at Lin En up and down, he frowned. The murderous aura and bloodiness exuding from Lin En's body was too great. It was too strong, not like a normal human being at all. He had only encountered this kind of aura from a monster. As his eyes met Lin's, he was filled with lust. The murderous eyes were startled, and a magic circle appeared involuntarily under his feet. Lin En's eyes flashed with excitement, and a hoarse voice came out of Lin En's throat, smiled ferociously at the man who suddenly appeared in front of him and said, "Magic, can you finally make me happy? Come and kill me." Thinking of the sword demon. Lin En's deep voice became more and more crazy, with a roar at the end. Seeing such a crazy Lin En, the man was immediately frightened. The magic circle under his feet was not easy to detect, took a step back. What a monster! The man cursed secretly, completely losing the desire to fight Lin En, and turned around to leave. But the moment he turned around, a heavy claw with a strong smell of blood fell on his shoulders. Hey! Where are you going? The man suddenly broke out in cold sweat. He didn't even notice when Lin En appeared behind him. The strong smell of blood kept impacting his spirit, and he quickly stepped away and distanced himself from Lin En. The man was petrified. The magicians also reacted and came here following Lin En's footsteps. When they saw Lin En confronting the man, they immediately recognized the man's figure. This guy is the leader of Dillis's gang, Dillis. Wasn't he stopped by Dars and the others? Why did he appear here? As for Dalzi and the others, why didn't they see them? Lin didn't notice the magicians behind him at all, or rather ignored them. His eyes fell directly on Dillis. His face was covered with bright red blood, and Lin looked at Dillis with a ferocious smile. Liz said, "Come on. Come and fight. Come and kill me." The crazy voice echoed in everyone's ears, and they were startled by Lin En's eyes at this moment. These magicians had never seen such a person before. Dillis even cursed in his heart, and walked towards him involuntarily. I took several steps back. What kind of monster is this? Dillis' eyes scanned the surroundings, and then the magic array under his feet suddenly lit up, and huge magic power was injected into the magic array. Dillis's speed became extremely fast, and his figure disappeared from everyone's sight in an instant. The night covered it. The afterimage of Dillis disappeared in front of Lin's eyes in an instant. Lin's face suddenly darkened, and his breathing became heavier and heavier. Overwhelmed Lin's consciousness. Roar. You deserve to die. You deserve to die. Lin's eyes were red, with violent anger exuding all over his body. He let out a beast-like roar in his throat, and wings suddenly sprouted from behind him. The wings fluttered and flew into the air, and the vertical pupils in his eyes kept scanning the manor. Finally, Lin En's eyes were locked in one direction. Lin En saw Dillis's figure in his sight, and his vertical pupils stared at Dillis's figure tightly, with a violent murderous intention in Lin En's eyes. It was released unabashedly. Black Dragon a Euro-S. Roar. Fluttering his wings, Lin En's figure floated under the moonlight. In front of Lin En, a dark magic circle slowly lit up. Magic power continued to pour out of Lin En's body and penetrated into the magic circle in front of him. The next moment, a dragon's breath filled with endless darkness spurted out from Lin En's mouth, rushing straight towards Dillis. The dragon's breath was extremely violent, destroying everything in front of it. The afterimage Dillis suddenly noticed the coolness behind him. He turned his head and saw a huge stream of dark magic light falling from the sky, rushing towards him with an endless aura of violence. Behind him, everything was gone. Swallowed and destroyed by this darkness. No. Dillis was shocked, with despair in his eyes, and let out a scream. The next moment, he was enveloped by this stream of dark light. His whole body was torn apart by the dragon's breath, and his flesh and blood were completely obliterated by the darkness, leaving nothing behind. The next trace. Dragon breath did not stop after killing Dillies, and rushed straight out of the manor, hitting a tall mountain in front of it with the sound of explosion. A corner was shattered. The magicians who stayed there took a closer look, and were immediately frightened by the scene in front of them. Their faces turned pale as the dragon's breath dispersed, and Lin En fell from the sky with a sullen expression. The red color dissipated a lot, but the bright red stain all over his body still made many magicians behind him take a step back unconsciously. Lin En let out a breath and cleared his mind. The overwhelming negative emotions were suppressed. Lin En's eyes gradually regained their clarity. Thanks for watching.